What do you say we get started? Thanks for coming over here today. For the record, I'm Jim Schowalter, Commissioner of Minnesota Management and Budget, and it's great to be here together again at the Department of Revenue. Today, I am joined with Dr. Laura Kalambokidis, our State Economist, and Britta Reitan, our State Budget Director. We'll be providing you with the latest 2021 budget and economic forecast. Included in it is national economic data from our consultants, IHS Markit. After our presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A. Governor Tim Walz will join us, give remarks, then take your questions. Before I begin, I want to thank first the team from MMB and state agencies generally for the work that they've done, asking questions, putting the information together, and helping us put together the information and the briefing that you see today. As a reminder, slides of this presentation, all supplemental information will be available on our website, mn.gov/MMB. I feel like we've been on a year-long roller coaster. And we got on this unwelcome ride about a year ago, last February. At the time, the state's economy was running well. We had a budget surplus, low unemployment, and good news all around. The path changed really quickly from there, with a surprising turn just this last fall, when we announced that despite significant economic hardship, the state's budget was in better shape than expected, with a $600 million surplus for the current biennium. However, we were still anticipating a $1 billion shortfall for the next biennium, the one that we're working on right now to build a new budget. Today's forecast continues the good news from November. Minnesota's budget outlook is significantly better for this biennium and the next. And the U.S. economic outlook bolsters revenues for the state. There's no longer an anticipated shortfall for 22 and 23. And we now project a positive balance of $1.6 billion. This improvement is directly related to federal pandemic relief that has emerged since the last forecast. The impact of these bills has raised the revenue forecast and lowered the spending estimates that we anticipate for the budget period. Budget Director Reitan will talk about this in more detail, about how our spending estimates have been decreased for medical assistance due to increased federal assistance, separate from the lower enrollment that we're anticipating in our E12 figures. I want to make it clear that this forecast does not include potential direct payments to states, even as those are being discussed in Congress right now. As you saw in our title slide and our forecast book cover, the sun is beginning to shine. We're showing improvements in both the state economy and the state budget situation. That good news may lead some to think that the wild ride is over. Is the state economy and the budget back to where we were last year? No. Today's revenue projections for the next 2 years still show $450 million less revenue than we'd anticipated previously. And that figure would be much worse if not for the federal action. The state's budget picture also does not include the individual household challenges, harm, shortfalls that we see for many Minnesotans based upon the impact of the COVID-19 virus, both for their health and their pocketbook. Unemployment continues to disproportionately impact lower wage workers and certain service sectors. Dr. Kalambokidis will talk about this more in her presentation. First, I'm going to dig into the numbers. This slide shows you the $1.6 billion anticipated as a balance for 22-23. You'll see that the projected deficit is eliminated, and out on the bottom line, you'll see a swing of $2.45 billion. That gets us to the $1.6 billion projected surplus. Included in that is increases in that first line of $546 million. That's money left on the bottom line from the current fiscal period. That's $546 million more than we'd anticipated in the last forecast, for a total of $940 million, of which that's a significant part of the $1.6 billion we're looking at for the budget period. This change is, again, really large, unusual for the circumstances, in part because it's so late in the biennium. We don't typically see such large changes in federal fiscal policy either. The second piece that goes into this forecast are significant revenue and spending changes. Here you'll see a $1.4 billion revenue change compared to previous projections, and a $456 million decrease in projected spending. Lastly, there's a small change in the stadium reserve. This graphic pulls it together and tries to show you what this $1.6 billion looks like and where it comes from. $491 million of it is due to, quite simply, moving money from one pocket to another. At the end of the last legislative session, there was agreement to reduce the budget reserve and include that as revenues, include that as resources in the current budget period. So that's for the first roughly $500 million of the surplus. Another $940 million of it is the money that I talked about just a minute ago, money that's still from this current fiscal year that'll be rolled into the two-year budget period. Very little of the announced surplus actually comes from activities in fiscal years 22 and 23. We only anticipate about $260 million in revenues above and beyond anticipated spending for that period. I know some of you will ask, it doesn't quite add up. You're right. There's one other piece, which is the stadium reserve. There's been growth in that stadium reserve. That is walled off, so it's not part of the anticipated balance and revenues that are available in the general fund. So, even though this is really good news, this is absolutely good news for the state's fiscal health, it's important to note as the state's chief financial officer that the bulk of this money is really from one-time resources. And so we'll have to be careful and we'll have to manage it appropriately. With that, let's get into the economy and the national forecast. I'll turn it over to our state economist.
Thank you, Commissioner. Thank you, everyone, for being here. I'm Laura Kalambokidis, Minnesota State Economist. I will start with the U.S. outlook and how it has changed since November. Then I'll turn to Minnesota's economy, and then I'll give details on the revenue forecast, part of which you just heard. In this chart, the height of the bars shows annual U.S. real GDP growth. The blue bars show the history and the February forecast by IHS, Minnesota's consulting firm. The green bars show IHS's November forecast, so the one that informed our November economic forecast. You can see in the history the economic contraction or decline in real GDP that occurred during the last recession. We had a 0.1% decline in 2008 and a 2.5% decline in 2009. And then you can see the 10 years of fairly steady, moderate economic growth that followed. Now look at the right-hand side of the chart. IHS now estimates that real GDP declined 3.5% in 2020. So that's some of the volatility that we've been dealing with in the last year in terms of economic volatility. And they project annual growth returns this year at 5.7% before decelerating to 4.1% next year, and then growing on average 2.5% per year for the rest of the forecast period. IHS expects real GDP to regain or reach its pre-pandemic peak this year, but the economic recovery has been uneven and it is expected to continue to be uneven. GDP associated with production of goods has already reached its pre-pandemic peak, and the service sector is not expected to fully recover until widespread vaccination against the COVID-19 virus. The current forecast for 2021 real GDP growth is 2.6 percentage points higher than the prior forecast. This is a large forecast change to see from November to February. The primary reason for the change is the inclusion in the February forecast of the impact of two significant rounds of federal pandemic relief that were not reflected in the November forecast. First, there's the $900 billion package Congress passed at the end of 2020, which was not included in the November forecast. And then there's $1.5 trillion of additional federal relief from a proposal that is now before Congress. If Congress is considering it now, you would see the price tag attached to that as $1.9 trillion typically, but IHS is assuming $1.5 trillion of additional spending is enacted by mid-March and starts to affect the economy in the second quarter. Despite this improvement, this significant improvement from 3.1% to 5.7%, the U.S. outlook remains volatile and uncertain and depends critically on the path of the pandemic. In this forecast, IHS assumes that the rate of COVID-19 infections continues to recede from its peak of last month. IHS now expects widespread effective vaccination of the U.S. population by the fall. This chart shows the forecast change in real consumer spending growth. So consumer spending is 2/3 of real GDP. So changes in consumer spending can have a big impact on the economy. In addition, an increased consumer spending forecast often changes Minnesota's sales tax forecast. The additional federal stimulus and an improving COVID-19 situation have prompted IHS to raise their forecast for real consumer spending for both 21 and 22. After a decline of 3.9% in 2020, IHS expects spending to grow 6% in 21, an increase of 2.4 percentage points from their November forecast. They forecast 3% average annual growth from 23 through 25. Now, IHS and others have examined the impact of the stimulus payments that were made last year, and those payments did indeed support additional consumer spending, but they also supported a spike in consumer saving. For that reason, IHS assumes that not all of the stimulus that has arrived in January and that is expected to come later this year, that not all of it is going to be spent in 2021. Some of it will be saved and will be available for consumers to spend in 22. The pandemic-induced economic downturn that began in February of last year brought severe disruptions to Minnesota's economy. The commissioner talked about some of those. During 2020, the state experienced job and wage losses, a reduced labor force, and changes in consumer spending patterns. In this forecast, the improved outlook for U.S. economic growth in 21 and 22, that is supported by federal pandemic relief spending, drives our expectation that Minnesota's job and wage losses of 2020 will be followed by positive employment and wage growth through our forecast period. In this chart, I'm comparing Minnesota's labor market to the United States. The lines show the headline unemployment rate or the overall unemployment rate. The light line is for the United States and the dark line is for Minnesota. Minnesota's unemployment rate has fallen since its peak of 9.9% last May. In December, the state unemployment rate fell to 4.4%, down from 4.5% in November and well below the U.S. rate, which was 6.7% in December. However, the lower unemployment rate does not tell the full labor market story. In December, the decline in the unemployment rate was the result of a reduction in labor force, not as a result of unemployed job seekers finding work. Since the onset of the pandemic, Minnesota's labor force has fallen by 102,000. And we have 35,000 more people unemployed and looking for work than we did last February. Over the last year, Minnesota lost 248,000 jobs, with the largest gaps in industries most affected by social distancing and containment measures, particularly services that require personal interaction. Between February and December 2020, Minnesota's leisure and hospitality sector lost 123,000 jobs. That's 44% of the sector's February employment. These job losses have disproportionately impacted lower wage workers. Workers in that sector earn 46% less per hour on average than people do in the private sector as a whole. With this chart, I'm moving to talk about our forecast for Minnesota. And here we are showing the annual growth rate in total wage and salary income in the state of Minnesota. So the value we're measuring here is the sum of all the payrolls of all the employers of the state of Minnesota, and the height of the bar in each case shows the growth rate in that variable. The blue bars show the history and our current forecast, and the green bars show our November forecast. Again, you can see the decline in total wage income that occurred in the previous recession, 4.8%. We're now forecasting a decline of 0.6% for 2020, a smaller decline than we expected in November, and moderate growth averaging 5% annually thereafter. This relatively small decline, the 0.6% that we're forecasting that we expect happened in 2020, that relatively small decline in wage income in 2020, when the unemployment rate peaked at such a high level, arises because unemployment in this economic downturn has disproportionately impacted lower wage workers. We know, for example, that a large share of unemployment insurance benefits claimants in Minnesota were from lower wage occupations. So the wage decline is smaller than it would be if unemployment were more evenly distributed. Turning to the revenue forecast. The first two columns of this table show the current forecast and the forecast change for the current biennium, fiscal years 20 and 21, and the next two columns show the same for the next biennium. Total general fund revenues for FY 20 and 21 are now forecast to be $463 million more than the November forecast. The income tax forecast is lower than in November, and forecasts for all of the other major tax types have been increased. Individual income tax receipts are now forecast to be $100 million less than the prior forecast. A lower estimate for tax liability in tax year 2019, which is the base year for our income tax forecasting model, and other forecast adjustments lower the income tax forecast for the remainder of fiscal year 21. Sales tax revenue is now forecast to be $77 million more than the prior forecast. The higher forecast is consistent with that increased growth in consumer spending that I showed you earlier, and also due to higher collections so far this fiscal year. The corporate tax is projected to generate $238 million more than the prior forecast, based on a higher forecast for corporate profits this calendar year, and higher collections so far this fiscal year. The current forecast for total revenues in the next biennium is $1.423 billion higher than the prior forecast, and the forecasts for all major tax types have been increased. Now, it's important to keep in mind that fiscal years 22 and 23, particularly 22, is the period when most of the positive impacts of the assumed federal fiscal payments hit the income tax and the sales tax. The higher forecast for the income tax is primarily due to higher expected wage income, which I showed you in that wage income graph, and higher expected non-wage income. The sales tax forecast benefits from a higher starting point from the higher current biennium forecast for the sales tax and faster expected growth in taxable sales from that higher consumer spending forecast. The extraordinary volatility and uncertainty in the economy in the last year, arising from the pandemic, from a very sharp economic downturn, and significant infusions of federal fiscal support, have driven large changes in our economic and revenue forecasts. But we're not back, as you heard from the Commissioner, we're not back to where we thought we were 1 year ago. In the chart that you have in front of you now, the height of the bars shows our revenue forecasts for the current biennium on the left and the next biennium on the right. Now here we're not comparing to the November forecast as I have in my other charts. Here we're comparing to a full year ago, to the February 2020 forecast. The green bars show those February 2020 forecasts, and the blue bars show today's forecasts. So the distance between the height of the bars shows how far our current forecast is from where we thought we were a year ago. Our revenue forecast for the current biennium is $1.2 billion below what we forecast in February of 2020. And for the next biennium, our forecast remains $461 million short of where it was a year ago. Let me finish by reiterating some of the risks to this forecast. I've mentioned that the economic forecast depends critically on the path of the pandemic, including the impact of any new virus variants and the timing of when we achieve widespread, effective vaccination of the population. The full economic impacts of the $900 billion in federal relief that was enacted at the end of last year remains uncertain, and the additional $1.5 trillion of federal pandemic relief payments assumed in this forecast has not yet passed Congress. There is uncertainty about when consumers will feel safe enough to return to more normal spending on services and how much of the expected federal fiscal stimulus they will spend and how much they will save. This forecast depends on business owners having enough confidence in the recovery to continue investing in their businesses. A setback in business investment would slow growth. During the recovery, consumer spending is expected to be supported not only by federal relief payments, but also by improvements in household wealth from rising home and equity prices. A significant decline in household wealth, for instance, from a decline in equity prices, would create a negative wealth effect that would slow growth below the forecasted rates. And finally, with 28 months remaining until the end of the FY 22-23 biennium, even small changes in assumed rates of growth in important revenue sources can have big changes in the outlook for this biennium and next. I'll now turn it over to State Budget Director Britta Reitan.
Good afternoon. My name is Britta Reitan, State Budget Director with MMB. And with this next slide, we're turning to the expenditure side of the forecast. This slide shows the change in spending projections from the previous projections for the current biennium, fiscal years 20 and 21, and the next biennium, 22 and 23. Overall projected spending in the current biennium is down by $83 million relative to our prior estimates in November. The change in the upcoming biennium, 22 and 23, is a reduction of $456 million, again, relative to our November estimates. As you can see on the chart, E12 spending estimates are down $39 million in the current biennium when compared to November, and $165 million in 22-23 when compared to November. And there are two significant reasons for the change across this 4-year period. In 20 and 21, the change is due to lower pupil projections. The impact of lower students was reflected in our November forecast, but since that time, we've received actual data that has shown a further decline than previously forecast, with families delaying kindergarten, opting for private school enrollment, or homeschooling their students. In total, the student count in this forecast decreased by approximately 4,000 students relative to the November projection for this current school year. When compared to our February forecast from 1 year ago, the total student count for this school year has been reduced by almost 16,700 students. In FY 22-23, the reduced student counts continue to contribute to the downward change, but a reduction in compensatory aid accounts for the largest portion of the reduction in 22 and 23. Compensatory funding in the next biennium is reduced by $113 million from previous projections. The aid for compensatory funding for next year is based on the number of students in the current year that qualify for free and reduced lunch. Due to remote learning and changes in federal meal reimbursement requirements, fewer families are applying for free and reduced lunch. That's reducing the number of students that generate this aid as part of the count for the next fiscal year. This slide also shows the decrease relative to the prior forecast in Health and Human Services spending projections. The HHS expenditure forecast is down $54 million in 20 and 21 and $257 million in 22-23 relative to our previous estimates. A significant portion of the change in the current biennium, $35 million, is primarily due to reduced utilization of the Child Care Assistance Program in the current year. The change in 22-23 is primarily due to the assumption that the federal public health emergency will continue through the end of this calendar year. This means that the state would continue to receive increased federal support for the medical assistance program through that time period. The federal match during the emergency has increased by 6.2 percentage points. This increase in federal support lowers our state share of medical assistance by $305 million in the 22-23 biennium. And that $305 million is a net number, which includes the cost of maintaining continuous coverage for enrollees in the program, which is a requirement of the increased federal medical assistance match. Our previous projections for this had already recognized this increase in federal match through fiscal year 21. So with this forecast, we're adding an additional 6 months to that projection based on information we're receiving from the federal government. This next slide is similar to the slide Dr. Kalambokidis walked you through on the revenue side. It's comparing the projected spending in this February forecast to the projections for spending from our February forecast 1 year ago, before we knew the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. As you can see on the chart, our spending projections have decreased across the 4-year period from FY 2020 to the end of FY 2023. And that decrease is altogether nearly $1.8 billion. And these spending reductions are largely a direct result of changes due to the pandemic. The largest piece of that spending change is due to the increased federal support for medical assistance that I just walked through. This was not included in our forecast 1 year ago, and with this forecast, we are now assuming this assistance continues for 2 full calendar years, 2020 and 2021. Since last February, overall, this support has offset state spending projections by $1.185 billion. So nearly $1.2 billion of that change is from that increased federal support for medical assistance over the 4-year period. The other significant component of change since last February is reduced spending in E-12 education. Again, this is due to changes brought about by the pandemic, with fewer students in our public schools than were previously projected. Changes in E-12 education spending result in nearly $500 million in reduced projected spending over this time horizon when compared to the projections we made 1 year ago. Moving to the next slide, we return to a view of total revenues and total expenditures in the general fund. This slide shows the upcoming 22-23 biennium, as well as provides a look at the planning estimates for FY 24 and 25. And this is the first look we've shown of FY 24 and 25. This slide is showing that we have structural balance, both in this upcoming biennia and a projected structural balance in 24 and 25 as well. And by structural balance, we mean we are just comparing the revenues in that biennium to the expenditures in that biennium, without including the impact of carry forward or changes in the reserves. You can see with this forecast, we are projecting structural balance in both biennia, meaning that our revenues in both biennia are projected to exceed spending. The structural balance in 22-23 totals $260 million. And this number is consistent with the number Commissioner Schowalter walked you through a little bit earlier. But in another positive piece of news, the structural balance is projected to grow into 24 and 25 to $845 million. That growth in the structural balance between the biennia is because the revenue estimates are growing faster than the expenditure estimates in this forecast. And you can see that displayed in the annualized growth section of the table. Finally, we do not include an estimate of inflation in the expenditure side of our forecast generally. So we do provide an estimate down on the last line on this slide to show the impact of inflation on the spending for 22 and 23. Inflation, as I said, is generally not included in the forecast, but there are some programs that include an inflationary factor into a formula, or they're based on actual costs, and so we exclude those from this calculation of inflation and only apply an inflationary factor to those expenditures that don't already have inflation built in. So this estimate of inflation shows the pressure that will be on the expenditure side of the budget in 22-23 and 24 and 25 of a little over $1 billion in 22-23 and $2.5 billion in 24 and 25. And with that, I'll pass it back to Commissioner Schowalter for some concluding comments.
Thank you, Britta. We have weathered a tumultuous year and are well aware that the effects of COVID-19 continue to hurt many Minnesotans, both their health and their pocketbook. But brighter days are ahead. increasing numbers of people getting vaccinated, lower test positivity have put some wind in our sails. Today's news adds to that. With today's fiscal information, we know that we're able to weather the last year's volatility without making untimely cuts, having time to gather information, to assess, and ultimately help people through this period. As a state, we managed to do what we could and are finding now that the federal partners are helping to complete that picture, filling in gaps and lifting the picture for state budgets, for local budgets, and unemployed Americans. While the sun is starting to shine, we're hardly in the clear, and we continue to have uncertain times. While our economic consultants see a stronger growth pattern ahead, we know that a lot of this is based upon anticipated federal pandemic response. That money's not in the bank. We know that the pandemic has had inequitable and devastating impacts on many Minnesotans. And we continue to have uncertain futures and paths forward for kids, for families, and for businesses. As the governor and the legislature continue to craft the next biennial budget, I think you hear my caution. Our forecast improvement is primarily based on one-time news. With revenues showing growth and spending reflected without inflation, we know that we still have difficult choices ahead, even as this is good news and puts us in a better position than we were yesterday. With that, let's get to some questions.
Commissioner, could I ask you about the rainy day fund? You talked about the required withdrawals from the rainy day fund based on the 2019 budget deal. So my first question is, if the state decided not to do that, I assume that would take a statutory change. And my second question is, that withdrawal now puts you beneath the statutory cap for the rainy day fund. What is the scenario that because of that and these numbers, you would have to make a deposit again? I think it's in November forecast that you make that calculation.
Wonderful question. A couple of points in there. You're right that sort of reinvestment in the forecast reserve isn't a part of this forecast. What the question really points to is the 491 that was part of the statutory change last year that reduced the cap of the budget reserve for this upcoming budget period. It would take legislation to change it back. So it isn't an automatic mechanism. It is a statutory change that said that we will take that 491 out. It will be part of the budget discussions of what that reserve level will be appropriately going forward.
Commissioner, what do we know about the state and local government aid that Congress is currently considering, and what sort of formula will be used? And are states that are doing better going to be penalized in the calculations as far as you know?
Yeah, the question is what kind of federal help is anticipated for local units of government or state governments, I guess for that matter, in the pending stimulus package. And, I think the question right now is we're not sure. It is still at a very early stage. What you see in this forecast is the anticipation of a $1.5 trillion package making its way through Congress and signed into law, knowing that that will have a significant impact on the national economy. But there's not a lot of specific assumptions underneath that are really clear at this point in time. That's going to be part of, I think, our investigation as that bill moves through Congress to understand exactly what is available for the state, what kind of programmatic aid is available, what kind of relief fund for the state, and really what's the allocation. I think it's really important to note Minnesota isn't back to where it was prior to COVID-19. I think it's really important to note that UI, unemployment insurance, is an important metric for looking at what kind of impact COVID-19 has had on our economy. And ultimately, it's still up to the governor, myself, our teams, the legislature, for managing our side of the fence as well as possible, and we've been trying to do that.
Commissioner, are you worried at all that surpluses?
If you just say it loudly, I'll probably pick it up.
Are you worried at all that the surpluses in states like Minnesota are going to lessen the need or lessen the appetite to get a deal on this in Congress at all?
I think it's pretty clear that this forecast wouldn't be nearly as positive without the assumption and partnership of the federal government and anticipating that help coming. Without knowing that Congress was already moving in this direction, without knowing that FEMA was already helping us with 100% reimbursement for eligible expenses, without knowing that we were getting more money for our Medicaid expenditures, this forecast wouldn't be so positive. So I think what you're really seeing is some of the reflection of what's happening and what we're seeing coming from the federal government.
And just to be totally clear, the numbers included today do include both the money that came previously and the anticipated money. Okay.
Yeah, this forecast includes really two different stimulus assumptions. One was the deal that was reached in December after the last forecast, and which was kind of questionable up until the time that it was signed. And this one, which is still not enacted, but is part of our national economic forecast.
Forgive me if I'm missing something. You're saying that the federal government spending is a major, if not the biggest driver of this. I'm not quite following how it's not as big or just a bigger driver, that there are a lot of people out there who continue to make money and are spending more and are making more than they were just forecast to do so, and the state is just raking in money through those taxes. That's not government funds, right? That's just economic activity.
Great question. So it is really important to know, we don't tax the GDP. We tax activities. And so the state revenue forecast is based upon estimates of consumer spending, income, corporate earnings, many other things. What we're basing this forecast on is national economic data and assumptions about what kind of economic activity is going to be there, and ultimately how that translates into state revenues. So, at the end of the day, the federal economy, the national economy is buoyed by additional federal help. That improved economic productivity activity reflects itself on the state's budget, local activities, local units of government as well.
Did IHS specifically state, and I haven't read all the supporting documentation, did they state that the federal government's response was the primary driver of this? This may be a question for Dr. Kaye.
It's probably more for Dr. Kalambokidis. I'm certainly cutting it short, but in terms of the big things from the November forecast to the February forecast, the changes in the federal assumptions is a significant change. But Dr. Kalambokidis is our economist. Let's let her discuss.
Yes, so when our macroeconomic consulting firm changes their assumptions about how the economy is going to grow, whether it's because of some change in the economic fundamentals or it's because of an infusion of stimulus or pandemic relief into the economy, we generally accept that. When we accept that economic outlook as the basis, the starting point for our economic forecast, we're accepting that assumption that this spending will occur. The change between the November outlook and the February outlook for IHS is because of the changes in those federal assumptions. So the $900 billion change that occurred at the end of 2020 that was not in the November outlook, and then the $1.5 trillion that they assume is going to be enacted in March. There were other factors going on. There was an improved COVID-19 situation. But there were also factors moving in the other direction. IHS has lowered, for instance, their forecast for U.S. population growth. And so with the negatives and positives offsetting, the largest component of the change was indeed the federal stimulus. And so the assumption that we're making is that this federal stimulus is going to enter the U.S. economy, and that is going to boost those economic factors, like, as the commissioner said, income, consumption. The simplest way to think about it is individuals will get a stimulus check, and then they decide whether they're going to save or spend that stimulus check. And if they spend it in Minnesota on taxable goods, that raises our sales tax forecast, or our sales tax receipts, more than they would have been otherwise. But what we're not assuming in this forecast is that any of the direct payments to state and local governments that might arise from the bill that is being negotiated now, that those are not included in this forecast. It's just the impact of federal fiscal policy on the economy.
Can I ask a question about the $900 billion? Do you have any way of knowing how much of that has entered the economy? And I guess I'm thinking of some of the payments that came to the state are still on the sidelines, like the $375 million in rental assistance. And it seems there's other payments that have come to the state or to locals that has not been spent yet. But certainly the cash payments to individuals have at least entered the economy or bank accounts. Do you have any way of knowing how much of that 900 is been activated in the economy? And as far as the other ones, maybe this is for the commissioner, why hasn't some of these other dollars been put into the economy, specifically the rental assistance?
And the answer is I don't know how much of that money came to Minnesota and how much has entered the economy. Specifically the stimulus checks that you mentioned that came in January, those appear to have arrived and had their impact.
Commissioner, how do you gauge the wisdom of, given that this seems to be much of it one-time funds, which seems to be inherently unstable, even though you are projecting a rather large structural balance going into 24, how do you gauge the wisdom of any change to the if there be tax hikes or what?
The wisdom of any change, I think, is ultimately a balance of what are the needs, what are the priorities, what are the risks you're willing to take. I think this gives the governor and the legislature opportunity to make some changes that otherwise they'd have to make really difficult trade-offs to achieve. That said, we're going to have to continue to monitor it closely because the path of the pandemic is not done. The recovery is far from certain. And the sustaining that growth, sustaining the education of our kids, the return to businesses, that's all work that's still ahead. So I think ultimately it's just a reminder that we may have a surplus, we may have good fiscal news, but there's work to be done today, and there'll be work to be done tomorrow.
On that point, Commissioner, how much faith should the public and lawmakers put into these numbers when you look at the change from February to May, May to November, and now another huge swing between November and now?
Put a lot of faith in it and know that they're going to change again. The simple truth is that nobody at the time of the last forecast anticipated the next federal stimulus bill. It was quite uncertain as to whether that was going to happen. And certainly a second stimulus bill was even more speculative. So we're all acting, we're all trying to make our best decisions given the information we have today. And it's now really up to the governor, to legislative leaders to make those next steps.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. Did you say you do not put a lot of faith in it, or you do?
I do put a lot of faith into numbers, and I know they're going to change again. So I think we should probably wrap it up. I see the governor in the back, but appreciate the opportunity to present the forecast, and here's Governor Tim Walz.